The city of Lagos is known for many things. But for several minutes, running into hours, Murtala Mohammed, the third military head of state of post-independence Nigeria, was assassinated with astonishing ease at a traffic jam in Lagos. On the morning of February 13, 1976, Nigeria's head of state left his home in Lagos and began the short journey to work. There was no enormous presidential convoy clearing the streets ahead of him, no armored fortress surrounding his vehicle, no procession of heavily armed soldiers sealing every junction. General Murtala Mohammed, one of the most powerful men in Africa, was traveling through Lagos in a black Mercedes-Benz, moving through the same traffic ordinary Lagosians faced every morning. He was 37 years old. He had ruled Nigeria for barely 7 months. And somewhere along his route, armed men were waiting. They knew where he was going. They knew how he traveled. And most importantly, they knew how vulnerable he was. When traffic brought the head of state's Mercedes to a halt near the Federal Secretariat area in Ikoyi, the men moved. Within moments, gunfire tore through the car.
Incoming! Everybody down!
Nigeria's leader was dead. But killing Murtala Mohammed was supposed to be only the beginning. The assassination formed part of an attempt to overthrow the government of Africa's most populous country. Yet the soldiers who successfully killed the head of state were about to learn one of the most dangerous lessons in the history of coups. Killing the ruler is not the same thing as capturing the state. Within hours, the coup began collapsing. Its leader, Lieutenant Colonel Buka Suka Dimka, fled Lagos. Then began one of the most extraordinary manhunts in Nigerian military history. A chase through roads, checkpoints, hotels, old relationships, and narrow escapes, until the man who had announced a new government to millions of Nigerians suddenly became the most wanted fugitive in the country. This is the story of the assassination of General Murtala Mohammed, the failed coup of February 1976, and the capture of Buka Suka Dimka. To understand why Murtala Mohammed was assassinated, we have to return to the Nigeria he inherited. By 1975, the country had already experienced independence, political crisis, military coups, ethnic violence, civil war, and almost a decade of military government. General Yakubu Gowon had ruled Nigeria since 1966. Under Gowon, the country survived the Nigerian Civil War and then entered the oil boom years. But his government was increasingly criticized over corruption, administrative weakness, and the repeated postponement of a return to civilian rule. Inside the armed forces, younger officers were growing impatient. Then, in July 1975, while Gowon was attending an Organization of African Unity summit in Kampala, Uganda, soldiers moved against his government. The takeover was largely bloodless, and the man who emerged as Nigeria's new head of state was Brigadier Murtala Mohammed. Murtala was already a major figure in Nigeria's military history. He had been involved in the turbulent events surrounding the counter-coup of July 1966 and later commanded troops during the Nigerian Civil War. He was energetic, forceful, and controversial. But what immediately distinguished his new government was speed. Murtala moved as though he believed Nigeria had already wasted too much time. His government launched sweeping changes throughout the civil service. Thousands of officials were removed or retired in what the regime presented as an attack on corruption, inefficiency, and administrative decay. Military governors were replaced. The government considered reducing an army that had expanded enormously during the Civil War. a timetable for returning Nigeria to civilian rule was announced. Local government reforms were pushed forward, and on February 3, 1976, only 10 days before his assassination, Nigeria was reorganized from 12 states into 19. His government also advanced the idea that Nigeria needed a new federal capital, away from the congestion and geographic position of Lagos. That capital would eventually become Abuja. Then there was foreign policy. Murtala wanted Nigeria to speak with greater authority in Africa. His government supported African liberation movements fighting white minority rule in southern Africa and backed the MPLA during the struggle for control of Angola. In January 1976, at an extraordinary summit of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa, Murtala delivered the speech that would become inseparable from his legacy. Africa has come of age. Nigeria's young military ruler was becoming one of the continent's most recognizable political voices. But rapid reform does not only produce admirers. Careers had been destroyed, officials had been removed, officers faced uncertain futures. Positions of influence had changed hands. The army itself was facing restructuring, and beneath the surface of Murtala's government, another group of soldiers was preparing to move. At the center of the conspiracy was Lieutenant Colonel Buka Suka Dimka. Dimka was not an outsider attacking Nigeria's military establishment. He was a product of it. He had served through some of the most violent and unstable years in Nigerian history. Like Murtala, he had lived through the coups of 1966. He had served under Gowon and had been associated with the military movement that removed Gowon in 1975. That makes what happened next particularly revealing. The system that helped bring Murtala Mohammed to power also produced the officers who would attempt to destroy his government. The conspiracy appears to have brought together men with different grievances. Some were unhappy about changes within the military. Others were dissatisfied with appointments, promotions, or the direction of Murtala's government. Later investigations would claim that the conspiracy extended beyond Dimka himself. One of the most significant figures accused was Major General I.D. Bisala, who had served as Defense Commissioner. But not every motive surrounding the coup is equally clear, and one question would become especially controversial after the rebellion collapsed. Was Dimka trying to seize power for himself, or was former head of state Yakubu Gowon expected to return? That question would haunt the aftermath of the coup. What is certain is that by February 1976, the conspirators were prepared to act. Their targets extended beyond Murtala Mohammed. If the coup was going to succeed, the leadership of Nigeria's military government had to be neutralized quickly. The date selected was Friday, February 13th, and the most important target was the head of state. Murtala Mohammed's morning began like countless mornings before it. He prepared to travel toward Dodan Barracks, the seat of Nigeria's military government. His driver was Sergeant Adamu Michika. His aide-de-camp was Lieutenant Akintunde Akinshahinwa. His orderly, Staff Sergeant Michael Otuwu, was also traveling with him. What remains extraordinary is how lightly protected the head of state was. Murtala did not move through Lagos, surrounded by the kind of enormous presidential security operation that would later become familiar around African heads of state. His black Mercedes was not an armored fortress. His routine was predictable, and his route was known. On ordinary days, that simplicity contributed to an image of a leader who was not entirely separated from the country he governed. On February 13th, it became a fatal weakness. The Mercedes traveled through Ikoyi toward Dodan Barracks. Then Lagos traffic brought the vehicle to a halt near the Federal Secretariat and Alagbon Junction area. For perhaps the most powerful man in Nigeria, it was an unusually helpless position. Cars were in front of him. Traffic limited movement. His vehicle was not heavily protected, and the men planning to kill him had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. They approached the Mercedes. Some later accounts describe weapons being concealed beneath flowing clothes. According to the recollections associated with the attack, Dimka himself was among the men involved. Then, the shooting began. The driver, Sergeant Michika, was struck. More attackers closed around the car. Gunfire ripped through metal and glass. Inside the Mercedes, there was almost nowhere to escape. The ADC, Lieutenant Akinshahinwa, appears to have survived the initial attack long enough to attempt resistance. He got out and returned fire. He was killed. Murtala Mohammed was fatally hit. His driver was dead. His ADC was dead. And within moments, Nigeria's head of state had been assassinated in broad daylight on a Lagos road. The attackers had succeeded in the most shocking part of their operation. But killing Murtala did not give them control of Nigeria. Now came the part of the coup they had not mastered. They had to convince the military and the country that Murtala's government no longer existed. In 1976, a coup was not only fought with guns, it was fought with radio transmitters. There was no social media, no mobile phone network spreading videos across the country in seconds, no 24-hour television news environment capable of challenging a coup announcement instantly. For millions of Nigerians, whoever controlled national radio had the ability to define what people initially believed was happening. The conspirators therefore moved against broadcasting facilities in Lagos. Then Nigerians heard the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Buka Suka Dimka. He announced that the government had been overthrown. Military governors were stripped of authority. Senior officers were ordered to remain where they were. Divisional commanders were warned against issuing instructions. Borders, airports, and seaports were declared closed. A curfew was announced, and anyone resisting the new order was threatened. The language was absolute. Dimka's message was constructed to create the impression that the coup had already succeeded, that the argument was over, that the armed forces were behind him, that Nigeria now belonged to the men who had killed Murtala Mohammed. But there was a devastating problem. Dimka was announcing control he did not actually possess. Military formations across Nigeria had not collectively joined him. Commanders remained outside his control. Several senior members of the government were still alive, and those officers were listening to the same broadcasts as everyone else. The assassination had succeeded. The coup had not. Almost immediately, the illusion began to break. Military commanders outside Lagos rejected the coup. Broadcasts contradicting Dimka's claims began reaching Nigerians, and that mattered enormously. A coup survives partly on psychology. If commanders believe resistance is useless because every other military formation has already accepted the new government, hesitation can become surrender. But once officers begin hearing other officers publicly reject the takeover, the illusion of inevitability collapses. Dimka had seized a microphone. He had not seized the Nigerian armed forces. More importantly, Murtala's assassination had failed to destroy the entire command structure. Lieutenant General Olusegun Obasanjo, Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters and the second most powerful figure in the government, had survived. The Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Theophilus Danjuma, had survived. Loyalist officers were reorganizing. The regime had been decapitated at the very top, but it was still alive. Then, attention turned to the radio station. One of the officers who would become closely associated with that confrontation was Colonel Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida. Babangida knew Dimka personally. They were fellow soldiers. Their careers had passed through the same Nigerian military world. Now Dimka was inside the broadcasting station trying to overthrow the government, while Babangida was part of the effort to stop him. Over the decades, dramatic stories have grown around their encounter, including the famous tale involving champagne. That detail is difficult to establish with certainty. The known reality is dramatic enough. Babangida entered the station and confronted Dimka, while loyal forces gathered outside. For a brief moment, the future of the coup came down to men who knew each other standing on opposite sides of a rebellion. Babangida tried to persuade Dimka to abandon the operation. Outside, the balance of force was shifting. The rebels could no longer convincingly claim that the country belonged to them. Eventually, loyal troops moved against the station. Gunfire followed. The conspirators were driven out, and Dimka escaped. Only hours after broadcasting orders to an entire country, the man claiming to control Nigeria was running for his life. But another extraordinary episode would make the failed coup even more controversial. During the crisis, Dimka went to the British High Commission in Lagos. There, he reportedly attempted to obtain assistance contacting former Nigerian head of state Yakubu Gowon, who was then living in Britain. The request was refused. And immediately, a dangerous question emerged. Why would a coup leader attempting to overthrow Murtala Mohammed want to contact the man Murtala had replaced? Was Gowon expected to return? Had Dimka acted believing the former head of state supported the conspiracy? Did Gowon know anything about the plot? Or was Dimka using Gowon's name without authorization? After the coup collapsed, Nigerian authorities investigated alleged connections between the plotters and Gowon. Dimka made statements implicating him. The government accused Gowon of having knowledge of the conspiracy and demanded his return. Gowon denied involvement. That distinction matters. The accusation of a coup suspect and the findings of a military government investigating an assassination attempt against itself cannot automatically be treated as independently established proof. What can safely be said is that Dimka attempted to contact Gowon through the British High Commission. Nigerian authorities later accused Gowon of having knowledge of the conspiracy, and Gowon rejected the allegation. The controversy would survive for years. Dimka, however, had a far more immediate problem. Nigeria was looking for him. The government survived. Murtala Mohammed did not. Olusegun Obasanjo emerged as the new head of state and promised continuity with the programs Murtala's government had begun. Then security forces turned toward the conspirators. Dimka became one of the most wanted men in Nigeria. His description was circulated. Radio announcements appealed for information. Roads were watched. Checkpoints were established. Military units were alerted. Yet Dimka kept moving. He left Lagos and traveled north toward the Jos area, a region familiar to him. But the longer the manhunt continued, the more dangerous every movement became. Every checkpoint created another possibility of recognition. Every person he contacted could betray his location. Every hour allowed the government to strengthen its search. Then Dimka made a remarkable decision. He traveled toward southeastern Nigeria. Eventually, he reached Afikpo. He knew the area from his earlier military service, and familiarity could help a fugitive. It could also destroy him. People knew his face. According to later accounts, Dimka also wanted to see a woman named Ugo, described as an old girlfriend. If those accounts are accurate, it was an extraordinary risk. Nigeria's most wanted fugitive had returned to a place where people remembered him and contacted someone personally connected to his past. He checked into a hotel under another identity, but suspicion began spreading. People reportedly recognized him. Then, information reached the authorities. Soldiers moved toward the hotel. Soon, it was surrounded. It appeared the hunt was over. But Dimka escaped again. Later accounts describe an unusual detail about the room he selected. He reportedly preferred a room without protective bars across the window. That choice suddenly became critical. As soldiers searched the building room by room, Dimka realized they were closing in. He moved toward the window and disappeared through it. By the time the security forces reached his room, the man they had come to arrest was no longer there. He slipped through the surrounding area, reportedly moving across farmland before finding transportation and continuing toward Abakaliki. The situation was becoming almost unbelievable. His face was known nationally. His name was being broadcast. Security forces had been ordered to capture him. He had already been identified. And still, Dimka kept moving. But he could not continue forever. Eventually, the chase ended near Abakaliki. Accounts of the precise circumstances vary in detail, but according to widely repeated versions of the arrest, Dimka encountered a checkpoint and identified himself to a police sergeant. The most wanted man in Nigeria effectively announced that the hunt was finished. He was Buka Suka Dimka. He was handcuffed. Weeks after the assassination that had thrown Nigeria into crisis, the leader of the failed coup was finally a prisoner.
Dimka's arrest did not end the investigation. It widened it. The government wanted to know how many officers had participated, who had known about the conspiracy, and who had helped the plotters before or after the attack. Arrests followed. Military tribunals were established. Dimka could hardly claim he had never been involved. His radio broadcasts had been heard across Nigeria. Witnesses connected him to the operation. Evidence linked him directly to the coup. During the proceedings, recordings associated with the rebellion were played, and Dimka acknowledged his voice. The larger question was no longer whether he had taken part. It was how far the conspiracy extended beyond him. Major General I.D. Bisala became one of the most senior military figures accused. Others were prosecuted for participating in the operation, assisting conspirators, possessing prior knowledge of the plot without reporting it, or helping fugitives. The government's response was severe. Executions took place in stages. Dozens of people were ultimately executed in connection with the coup attempt, while others received prison sentences or other punishments. The rebellion itself had lasted only hours. Its consequences lasted much longer. Then came Dimka's own fate. On May 15, 1976, approximately 3 months after Murtala Mohammed's assassination, Lieutenant Colonel Buka Suka Dimka was executed by firing squad at Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Lagos, alongside other convicted conspirators. Stories later circulated about Dimka maintaining his military bearing until the end, including an account that he demanded the formal respect his rank deserved from younger soldiers. Not every dramatic detail of those final moments can be established with certainty, but the central fact is beyond dispute. In February, Dimka had spoken over national radio as though Nigeria belonged to him. By May, he was dead. His coup succeeded in killing Nigeria's leader. It failed to give him Nigeria. Murtala Mohammed had ruled for approximately 200 days, less than 7 months. He died at 37. He never lived long enough to complete most of the programs his government had announced. And yet his name became deeply embedded in Nigeria's national memory. Lagos's major international airport bears his name. His face appeared on the 20 naira banknote. Roads, institutions, and public places were named after him. Some of the programs associated with his government continued under Obasanjo. The transition towards civilian rule continued. The project of establishing a new federal capital continued. And in 1979, Obasanjo transferred power to the elected government of President Shehu Shagari. But Murtala's short time in office also produced something more complicated: the mythology of unfinished possibility. Because he died so quickly, Nigerians never discovered what a long Murtala Mohammed government would actually have become. There was no second decade, no prolonged decline, no chance to watch enthusiasm turn into disappointment or reforms turn into something else. His political story stopped abruptly, and death froze the image of the energetic young ruler permanently in 1976. Yet his assassination also exposed something dangerous about the system that produced him. Nigeria's military governments existed inside a political world where yesterday's coup participant could become today's head of state, and today's fellow officer could become tomorrow's assassin. Murtala had risen through that world. Dimka had risen through that world. Gowon had risen through it. Obasanjo had risen through it. And Ibrahim Babangida, the officer who confronted Dimka during the coup, would himself become Nigeria's military ruler after another coup in 1985. That is why February 13, 1976, was bigger than the assassination of one man. It exposed how political power could depend on control of military formations, communications, personal loyalties, and the ability to convince an entire nation that a government had already fallen. Dimka understood some of those rules, but not all of them.
And perhaps the most powerful surviving symbol of everything that happened that morning is not a gun. It is a car. The black Mercedes-Benz in which Murtala Mohammed was attacked was preserved at the National Museum in Lagos. Look at that vehicle and the politics disappear for a moment. The speeches disappear. The uniforms disappear. The titles disappear. What remains are holes torn through metal. Hours before those bullets struck, the man sitting inside that Mercedes was Nigeria's head of state. He commanded the armed forces. He governed the most populous country in Africa. His government was changing Nigeria's administrative structure. It was planning a new capital. It was projecting Nigerian influence across Africa. Only weeks earlier, Murtala Mohammed had stood before African leaders and declared that Africa had come of age. Yet on the morning of February 13th, none of that power could protect him from something painfully ordinary: a routine, a familiar road, and traffic. The assassins knew his route. They knew his security habits. They knew he traveled without overwhelming protection. And they knew that eventually, Lagos traffic would make even the head of state stop. They exploited that vulnerability perfectly. But then the conspirators made their own fatal mistake. They confused the death of one man with the death of a government. They killed Murtala, but they did not destroy the command structure around him. They seized a radio station, but they did not seize the army. They issued commands, but commanders refused to obey. They announced victory, but Nigeria had not surrendered. And once the illusion disappeared, the coup collapsed. In a matter of hours, Buka Suka Dimka went from speaking to millions of Nigerians as the voice of a new regime to escaping from the forces of the government he had claimed no longer existed. From controlling the microphone to hiding from the country listening to it. From issuing orders to military commanders to passing through checkpoints, hoping no one recognized him. From escaping a radio station to escaping through a hotel window. And finally, from coup leader to prisoner. 3 months later, he faced a firing squad. Murtala Mohammed and Buka Suka Dimka had once belonged to the same military establishment. Both had lived through governments rising and falling through military intervention. Both understood the power of soldiers in Nigerian politics. But their lives ended on opposite sides of the same rebellion.
One became the assassinated head of state, whose name would survive on airports, roads, institutions, and currency. The other became permanently associated with the coup that killed him. The assassination itself lasted moments. The coup lasted hours. The manhunt lasted weeks. But decades later, the images of that morning remain. A Lagos road, stationary traffic, a black Mercedes, armed men approaching, the sudden sound of gunfire, a voice taking control of the radio, and an entire country waiting to discover who was actually in power. Murtala Mohammed was dead, but Buka Suka Dimka had made the fatal mistake of believing that killing Nigeria's leader meant he had captured Nigeria. He had not.